Let 'Em Go Barefoot is a podcast that dives into all things parenting and education through the lens of mindful awareness. Conversations aim to bring forward patterns, beliefs, and attitudes that shape our expectations and ideas about what it means to raise healthy children. With a blend of science, ancient wisdom, and intuition, we will explore ways to support, nurture, and connect with our growing children while also nurturing and expanding ourselves. I am grateful you are here. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 22 of the Let 'Em Go Barefoot podcast and the first episode of 2023. We are kicking off the new year with a little lesson in archetypes, which are considered to be universal, innate dispositions across cultures that influence how we behave and interact with one another. Many of you may be familiar with archetypes and how they are used in psychology, literature, and movies, which we do talk about, but mostly we discuss how they show up and influence us on a personal and a societal level. Hopefully you will walk away from this conversation with a basic understanding, but more importantly, an awareness about how they may be consciously or unconsciously driving you. If this is your first time tuning into the podcast, welcome. I am very glad you're here. I'm your host, Missy Willis, a veteran unschooling mom of two, former special education teacher, turned self-directed education advocate, and the creator of the Barefoot Playground, a virtual space for parents to gather to talk about things related to education, relationships, child development, neuroscience, and more. Speaking of, mark your calendars for this year's kickoff event, which will be Thursday, February the 16th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Cindy Gaddis will be joining me. She's the author of the book, The Right Side of Normal, Understanding and Honoring the Natural Learning Path for Right-Brain Children. She was also a guest on my podcast, not once, but twice. We had to do a part 1 and part 2 because there was so much information to cover. Now she's going to join me on the playground so that you will have access to her directly. You can ask her questions and consider it like a conference class, a class you would take in a conference or a seminar, but it's just virtual. So I hope you can join us for that. Okay, so I've talked enough. I think I've updated you. Please be sure to follow me over on social media, on Instagram at Let 'Em Go Barefoot. And let's get into this great conversation that I had with my longtime friend, Sheila Rumble, where we discuss archetypes, conscious and unconscious behaviors, being in shadow or in light, and how to show up as our best selves, even when the world feels chaotic. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Today I have Sheila Rumble on the podcast. Sheila and I have been friends for, let's think about this, Sheila, since
15 years.
I'm like 19 something. No, that's not right. 2007?
Oh gosh, yeah, babies.
Yes, because baby. Well, do we want to say baby names? We'll keep baby names.
We don't have to, but we'll just say babies.
So Sheila and I met through the homeschool community and became friends and sisters.
Yep.
So I asked Sheila to join me on the podcast today because she brings to the table such wisdom and insight in the world of understanding ourselves and the human experience through archetypes and archetypal study, through the energies of masculine and feminine, and how we show up in the world and the impacts that our experiences have on us, and also our, I guess, temperaments and personalities and how all those play out. And given the fact that we have a lot going on in the world in so many different areas, it seems like a logical choice to bring Sheila forward and ask her to share with us her wisdom. So welcome, Sheila.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. As you said, we met first in the homeschooling community, and I think we've watched each other grow over the past 15 years and morph into how we're showing up now, and also just been supportive of each other, especially these days when the world has just seemingly gotten so crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started out, I'm actually, as you know, I started out as a chemist, and I kind of got into this other realm when I was trying to heal an autoimmune condition, and Western medicine, everything they gave me just wasn't working, or I was reacting to it, and that took me into herbal medicine, and then that has kind of branched into all these other modalities, but basically centered around healing the self. And as part of that, and why I think this topic is so interesting, one of the best ways that we can know ourselves is to understand archetypal patterns,
Mm.
because as humans, we're so complex. And any one of us has a multitude of archetypal patterns, whether they're with us most of the time or they only show up here and there. But it does give us a way to break our personalities, which are very complex, down into parts and pieces that we can look at. We can look at a particular archetype and how it behaves, and not only understand ourselves better, but also how we're interacting with others. And it brings a level not only of awareness, but also it allows us to have some compassion
Mm.
for how we respond to different things.
I think that's a really good point to make, because sometimes, at least in the self-help world, there's kind of a almost an over emphasis on fixing ourselves and or focusing on the problems, and not
Hmm.
enough grace for why we are where we are, or even accepting the fact that it's just part of the journey and it's okay that we're kind of in a slump right now, or everybody has bad days and bad times and weird moments, and it's not to say that this is where it's going to stay. It just means that right now we're in some space that we need to be curious and look into this a little bit more, and maybe wonder why maybe something happened to get us to where we are. So so this is difficult. I will say, I'm going to say this out loud. This is difficult because you and I tend to we would sit in cars in waiting on our
Oh yeah.
daughters to
Yep.
finish their horse lessons and have like hours long conversations. So to try to put all this information into a podcast in a little like nice, neat format is definitely kind of difficult and challenging for
It
us.
is.
But we're going to try, because I think this topic is so important. And I think given what, like we said, what we're experiencing in the world on the individual level, on the local level, and then of course globally, it feels chaotic at this time. And
Hmm.
some of it, and you and I have talked about this, some of it I wonder, is it because of the fact of social media? Because we have access to information 24/7, and we know when something happens as soon as it happens, and it overwhelms our nervous system. And we almost feel like we have to respond to it, because to not respond to something that's terrible and sad and scary seems like not a very nice thing to do. So,
Yeah.
how do we square the overload of information with responding in such a way where we can be helpful, but not overwhelm ourselves with responsibilities and this kind of need to do something about it? Like, how
Hmm.
does that play out in the
That's a big
archetypes, I
question.
guess? I know that's a big one. And we can break it down if we need to.
Well, I mean, what I would say is that I think social media does play into it, because whenever we're triggered, what's actually happening is that we have a particular archetype that is responding to whatever's
Ah,
been said or seen. And so I think if you were to look at it archetypally, what's happening is, and it really depends on who you're, who you're studying, who presents these archetypes. I said that terribly, but for example, Carolyn Mace does a lot with archetypes, and she says in her framework that everyone has 12 main archetypes,
okay.
and then you have sometimes others, but 12 big players. So whether or not you believe that, but let's just work with that. Let's just say that we have 12 big players in our archetypal realm. Like, so okay, so an archetype, you would look at it almost like components of our personality,
Okay.
right?
And doesn't she
And
also
so,
say, sorry, doesn't she also say, or maybe everybody says this, that there's like four main archetypes that we all have?
well, she does say we have four main. Now, I don't know, like Jung did a lot of work with archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that he said that, but basically, what's generally accepted is that everyone has a child archetype.
Okay.
And so in her frame of reference, the child is one of the survival archetypes. And in fact, it's almost like the master archetype, because it is going to be the one that's going to trigger particularly the other three survival archetypes. So just so everybody kind of knows what those are. And like I said, I'm not sure that Jung ever went this direction.
Okay.
But they both say we have the child.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's generally accepted. Carolyn Mace also includes for everyone the victim, the saboteur, and the prostitute. And so, what the child is concerned with is making sure needs are met,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you can see how that can be a really big one for pretty much everyone. Because depending on how we grew up, and that doesn't mean that you had to have a bad childhood or a good childhood, both people are equally susceptible to having that child and the needs of the child left unmet, whether it was
Okay.
intentional or unintentional or just circumstances. Everybody sort of has that child that can rear up and feel like its needs aren't being met. And then once that happens, it can trigger the other three in various ways.
Okay. So when you said that, it immediately made me think of all the conversations and the talk about the inner child. Is that the same thing?
Yes. Yeah. A slightly, probably in some circumstances, a slightly different
Okay.
flavor. Because in this paradigm, what you're looking at, the inner child, like there's a lot of talk about the inner child and being playful and all that, and that is
Mm-hmm.
important. But when you're looking at it in this particular context, what you're looking at basically are needs being met.
Mm.
And so of which playfulness is only one aspect.
Okay.
And so yeah, if that child is feeling like its needs aren't being met, then it can trigger the victim. And of course, the victim, a lot of these have different meanings, right? Depending on how you're looking at it. But basically, the victim is about needing help or asking for help, or, kind of where you are in that realm. The saboteur is going to be about getting you out of particular situations. And then the prostitute negotiates your worth and your value.
Mm.
So we can have a negative connotation of those words, especially something like prostitute or saboteur. But in reality, they are keeping us safe, and they're very good at what they do. And so when you're looking at it from that context, for instance, the prostitute negotiating self-worth, the prostitute in shadow, right, would be a sellout, would sell out the worth of the self for
Mm.
material or whatever. But the prostitute in light negotiates a high
I
self-worth
see. Okay.
and brings you into alignment with situations that value who you are. Um, so yeah, those are the four main ones that are concerned with survival. And I think what's happening right now in the chaos of the world is that, first of all, those four are very active right now, because
Would
anytime.
you say they're active on the individual level and active on like a social
Oh
level? So
yeah,
would you say
definitely.
like,
Yeah.
okay, so like we have them in individual, but then we also have it like played out on the bigger stage.
Right, right.
Okay.
And when you think about them being survival, because there's so much chaos, I mean, think about a child in a very chaotic, unfamiliar environment, right? And so we're all
Right.
experiencing this to an extent where, and like I said, the child is kind of the master archetype and in many ways, and it will trigger, if it is triggered, it often triggers at least one of the other three along with it. And so we're seeing a lot of that play out. And then,
So can I'm sorry if I'm
no, that's
interrupting your
okay.
flow, tell me, but it
That's
just
okay.
whenever you say that, it makes me want to have like a concrete example. So it's like, I'm trying to think of something for myself that I can use as like an example of the child sort of in shadow and the child sort of in light. Because that's the other piece of it too, is that it's the archetypes are they're neutral, right?
Yes,
They're
yes.
neutral.
Well,
So
they're neutral when they're in balance.
imbalance.
But
Okay.
they all have light and dark aspects.
Right.
And so that's kind of what I was saying, especially with the saboteur or the prostitute. Sometimes the name reflects for us more of a negative attribute. But the reality is that they also have that positive when they're viewed in a particular light. And so some of
Mm-hmm.
that is perspective. But to give you an example, like a child can, in today's world, let's say you're on social media and you say something with good intentions and, well-meaning, and you get attacked for what you're saying. So you're being genuine, you're being honest with how you feel, but in today's cancel culture, you get blasted. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
variety of of ways this can play out, right? But let's just pick one, and we'll say the prostitute. So if the prostitute were operating in shadow, and what that means a lot of times when we're talking about shadow is more of an unconscious
Yeah.
um, kind of knee jerk reaction. The prostitute in shadow might say, okay, nobody agreed with me. I'm going to change my stance to match what is generally out there as accepted. So even though I feel
That's kind of that sellout sort of idea. Like,
exactly
I don't really yeah, I'm not staying in line with my own values because it's too uncomfortable to stand my ground. I
right,
need to shift.
right.
Okay.
But the prostitute in light, so the prostitute and when you're coming at this in a conscious manner, the prostitute says, I know, I know
Mhm.
that I came at this fully aware. I have considered all the options and I am good with what I believe, even if I have to stand against everyone.
Yeah.
And so, in that regard, you can see that the prostitute is holding up the value of the self.
Gotcha.
And yeah, so I mean that's one way that it can play out. And like I said, it all really depends on kind of what, are you reactive, or do you have the space to take a break and kind of consider everything and take a breath? And we don't
Mhm.
always. And so that's why this can be tricky sometimes to navigate. But um, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a great example because it's true and it's consistently going on and I don't see an end in sight. And I feel that the need to bring to everyone's attention this idea of light and dark and the yin and the yang and the chaos and order and all those opposites of existence is good to bring forward because unless you're directly taught that and or someone mentors you in that way, a lot of people don't really recognize that there are the opposites of everything, and just like you use the word
Yes.
prostitute, you hear that word and immediately people, I would imagine, I'm just making an assumption here that a lot of people go towards the negative connotation. And as
Right.
you're talking about it, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, I'm gonna be looking out for some good old prostitutes now.
Right.
It's like,
Well, and there used to be sacred prostitutes. I mean, just to give more of a context to that word, the temples had sacred prostitutes, and they were highly esteemed because of the role they played in the society and in the religion of the time. So, again, a lot of these contexts come from our modern
okay,
interpretation, but they haven't always
okay,
had that. And if that gives anybody kind of that allowance to um, broaden
mm-hmm,
their their perspective of not everything is all good or all bad. That's actually the rare cases. If you think of a bell curve, right? Most of it's going to lie somewhere in the
yeah,
middle, where the extremes are the all or sorry, where the extremes are either
mm-hmm,
or, and it's a very small
yes.
percentage. But we live in a world that wants to live in either or.
I see. Right. It has to be
And
this
it's
way
and
or
it's a
that
very
way.
unnatural
Yeah.
state. Right.
Yes.
And it's a very unnatural state. And so that is part of why as well, that the archetypal patterns are getting triggered.
Mhm.
Because so it's triggering our survival, but it's also triggering in a lot of ways the others that we would have predominant in our personality.
Okay.
So for just as an example, someone who is a mother, right, is probably going to feel particularly challenged in this current environment because of what's going on in the educational system or in the medical system. and I don't have to go any further than that, but I think a lot of mother archetypes feel very challenged right
Mhm.
now, and in an exaggerated way than, they might have felt 10 or 20 years
And would you
ago.
say that they're exaggerated simply because they feel like they have to be louder than they normally would have been because they're not being listened to? Or you think it's exaggerated because there's so much going on simultaneously?
I think because there's so much going on simultaneously.
And when you say the mother
I th-
archetype, that doesn't necessarily mean females. It means it could be is there a mother archetype in men, or is this solely for women?
um no, there's actually Mr. Mom is a modern archetype,
Ah, okay.
which would be the a man that stays home and or that predominantly cares for children. Um Generally speaking, mothers are associated with women, right? Fathers with men, but that isn't always the case. And it makes sense that it's not always the case because we all contain masculine and feminine qualities. And so
Right.
in a blend, kind of the same way we were talking about with archetypes, we have them existing in some kind of harmonic state. And that isn't always 50-50. And so
Mhm.
depending on, it's not really linked to women or men. It's just more common in women, and fatherhood is more common in men.
Okay.
But yeah, anybody can have, just like the career mom, we just name it a little different, but the career mom might present more of what we would traditionally consider associated with fathers,
Mhm.
especially if in that case the man is caring more for their children.
Right. I want to dig into that a little bit more. The whole energy part, the masculine and the feminine energy, and the need for it to be appreciated and respected as such. And also that we need each other. Because I feel as a mom, so this is my mother archetype coming out, I am overwhelmed
Mhm.
by the amount of negativity towards men in our society and have been witnessing that for quite some time. This idea that all men are blank or all such, the idea of taking any category of people, person, and putting them in the exact same category to me is, that's just an unhealthy
Yeah.
way to
Yeah.
view a situation in my mind. Because we're trying to say that if you fit this one particular descriptor, then all of these things are true about you. And we know that
Right.
that's very simplistic thinking and it doesn't benefit anybody because we're not narrowing in on the specifics of what it is that we're worried about. So we've talked about this, many many times about the swinging sort of
Mhm.
this push to almost malign masculinity because there's this idea that to be masculine equals to be controlling and overpowering
Right, right.
or somehow in a negative light. So, I mean, what would you say about that or what's your insight there?
Well, I mean, another conversation that we've had that I think is important is it's almost like the pendulum swing. So,
Mm,
and it's not always about reality, it's about the perception. And so, if you see the masculine as those traits, as being dominant and controlling, then what tends to happen is that then you would counteract that with the exact opposite, right? Going to the other
mhm.
extreme, and where you would be, cultivating the super nurturing and all that. We haven't seen that, which is kind of interesting because what we have seen instead is the feminist movement. I don't even know if you want to go in this direction, but the feminist movement really wasn't about embracing feminine qualities. It was really more about competing with men in a man's world. And it's always easy to look back and kind of critique what happened. I can understand why that approach happened, but it never really brought us into any kind of balance, which would normally happen.
Okay. So the feminist movement specifically was not necessarily adding more femininity, but it was adding more masculinity. Is that what I'm understanding?
Right,
Okay.
right. It wasn't ever really promoting the feminine aspects of women and rising those up in value. It was changing the way that females presented their femininity in society. And basically, it was just suppressed,
Interesting. Okay.
increasing the masculinity so that they were competing almost on a more level playing field.
Okay.
And so, now what has happened is so every archetype and a female the feminine, the masculine, those are both archetypes just as much as everything else is, right? They all want to exist in some sort of balance. And like we said earlier, it's very rare to actually be all. We're usually some sort of harmonization of the two
Okay.
and whatever proportion that looks like. But it's very rarely all or nothing. But that's not what happened with the masculine and feminine. So that's what I think we're trying to correct now. But again, we've just swung everything the other direction. Um, in almost like this extreme response to it,
Mm-hmm.
when what we really need is for everyone just to, I mean, really, if everyone just kind of took this as an archetypal pattern and said, okay, so I have this masculine and this feminine energy that coexists within my body. It's not necessarily 50-50. It's just whatever proportion feels right to me. And we went with that, it would be so much healthier, right? Of course it would be
Mm-hmm.
than what we're seeing now, which is, like you said, kind of putting everybody in these buckets and they're either or buckets, and there's
Yes.
no middle ground. And so
Right.
you've got to pick one bucket or the other bucket, and that's it. Those are the only options.
Yes. Yes. Well, and then when you look at this from a societal perspective, from where I sit in the world that I'm in and the information that I consume, I do feel like there's a call of the soul to be more compassionate and nurturing, and especially in the realm of the education world and the parenting circles, which is, we've been so, like, the whole idea of the patriarchy, and there's lots of words being thrown around right now, capitalism even, all these things are being thrown into this bucket of bad, when, as you've said before, there's this dark side to everything. And
Mm-hmm.
capitalism, for instance, isn't not in and of itself a bad idea. It's how it gets utilized for the benefit of those who are utilizing it. Are the people
Right.
engaging in capitalistic ideas in shadow, or are they doing it in a
Yeah.
conscious manner? So to
Right.
me, it's
Right.
not capitalism, it's capitalism in shadow.
Right.
So if you're the type
No,
of
that's
person,
exactly.
okay,
Yeah.
okay, so you can almost take that same sort of idea and place that as a template onto everything. So every, word that's being thrown around right now. As a matter of fact, I'm even going to throw out the word bully, because when my kids were
Mm-hmm.
younger, it seemed like that was the topic. Everybody's a bully. If you looked at somebody wrong,
Mm-hmm.
you're a bully. If you said something about somebody, you're a bully. It was just used, used, used. And that's actually an archetype, correct?
Mm-hmm. And it's so funny because I was actually going to bring that up earlier.
Really?
That's one of the archetypes. Yeah.
That's
Yeah. That one and vampire are two that come up a lot.
okay.
But there's only a certain a category of people that I see choose those. And it's very interesting when I see them choose it, because it to me means that they are very conscious of how they're behaving. Most people don't want them because they have such a negative connotation. Um, but for instance, the bully is a great example because, right, and we know the typical context, right, of what it is. But there's a light side to the bully that is very powerful, and it serves two functions. One, a bully has, if it's used consciously, and again, it's hard to have this conversation because we have a mental construct of what a bully
Mm-hmm.
is.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you try to talk about it in a positive context, people think that you're like, you're saying it's okay to be a bully.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're
You're trying to
saying. We're saying,
support the
though,
aggressor. You're not trying to support
right,
that. You're just saying, hey, listen to it in this context and maybe it'll make a little more
right.
sense. Okay.
And so a bully has, though, behind it a force of energy. And so when you look at it from that perspective, how is that force of energy being applied? Is it being an aggressor? or a perpetrator? Or conversely, are you using that force of energy to propel something forward that needs to be propelled forward? And so it's really the context of how you're applying it and whether you're doing it unconsciously and hurtful, or whether you're applying it constructively and consciously.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other aspect of the bully in light is that a bully in light is the perfect antithesis to the bully in shadow. So if you have a bully problem, what you want to remedy that is the bully that's in light, because they
Mm.
balance each other. And so the vampire does the same thing. If you have someone who has that kind of vampiric quality, they're just always drawing off of you and pulling off of you. The person that responds the best to that is actually someone who has that vampire archetype as well, but has brought it into the light, because they understand what's happening with the shadow and how unconscious it is, and they know how to respond to it.
Mm.
So yeah, sometimes the archetypes that we have villainized, or kind of we talk about them as being bad, are it's almost like the poison is the cure. Have you heard that?
Mm.
I think,
Mm-hmm.
am I saying that right? I might not have gotten that
Something
right.
along those lines.
And so in many ways that's kind of what we're seeing, but our society doesn't want to react that way. Our society is like, we deem it as bad. We don't want to, we're very um one dimensional in how we assign it good or bad. And it's either good or it's bad. And if it's bad, we just want to completely destroy it and get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that isn't that's not going to really get us very far,
It's not.
unfortunately.
And again, the whole push that I'm seeing in a positive way of trying to get us more in balance and trying to get us back to what really matters, and to stop, well, to essentially get back to what's more natural as far as the existence of humans in relationship with one another and in smaller like communities where we have a common purpose and goal. Um, I'm wondering if, when you were talking about the bully and the vampire, I always try to think of an example, like in physical form, someone who may represent that in shadow and represent that in light. And I always draw from movies and, fairy tales,
Oh
because
yeah.
that's, to me, if you really pay attention to any movie like Harry Potter, or all the Marvel movies, you can almost see all these archetypes playing out. And maybe,
Oh,
and maybe we
definitely.
should
Yeah.
talk about the movie that we saw in the movie theater. the,
Oh, okay. I'm like, oh, which
I
one was
know.
that?
Which one was it? Oh my gosh, Sheila. It's the one where WandaVision.
Was it the Doctor
Yes, there we go.
Strange?
Okay.
WandaVision
Well,
wasn't. It was
it
Doctor
was Doctor
Strange, I
Strange, but
think.
it was Wanda, the wizard witch
Oh,
Wanda.
right,
Okay.
right,
Yes.
right. The mother. Yeah, because I remember I was like, oh, that's the Dark
Yes,
Mother, or
yes.
whatever
And
I
I just
said.
remember
Yeah.
we watched that movie in the theater with our kids, and we all walk out, and I'm like, "Well, that was wild." And you were like, "Oh, I loved it," and I'm like, "Oh my god, she was crazy." But you saw it as that whole, like, that's the mother in shadow. And so, can we talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit, because I think that's a great representation. If people haven't seen the movie, it's Doctor Strange. I honestly can't remember the other part of it. It's the most
Yeah,
recent Doctor
it was
Strange
like one
movie.
the second. Yeah, I think it was the second one. And honestly, I don't even remember. Like, I have such a short memory that I don't remember exactly what happened, which is good because that way we're not giving any spoilers. But yeah, I mean, you're right, because in literature, and I don't remember if we said this when we were recording or not, but as we've had archetypal patterns as long as we've had
Yeah.
stories, because that's what stories are built around. And it's a way to break down these complex human personalities into something that is understandable
Mhm.
and that we can work with. And so that movie in particular was so great because it was the mother in shadow. But she couldn't see that she was in shadow. We could only see it really, from the outside looking in, because she thought that she was doing what
Yeah.
was best.
Right. Would
Um,
that
I think I'm remembering the
No,
right
you
one.
are.
Oh my gosh, now I think I'm getting
No, you
multiple
are.
mixed up.
You're remembering it. And also, would that be the same thing as devouring mother?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it depends. There's so many mother
Okay.
archetypes, and, it's probably along with child, there's a lot of sub-child archetypes. Mother probably has equally as many, so you can have I mean, I made some notes here. Oh, you can have so many, like, traditionally, you have the nurturing mother, the neglectful mother, the devouring mother, which is, a more extreme form, the fairy godmother. I mean, there's all of these, the virgin mother, earth mother, birth mom, adopted mom, mother
Mhm.
bear. So we have, like, an abundance of these archetypes, and it kinda depends on, I guess, what framework you're using, but essentially the devouring mother, I mean, I don't know because I don't remember the details of the movie enough, but the devouring mother is a mother who quite honestly never really developed her inner child, that child survival archetype. That isn't fully developed, and by that I mean brought into consciousness. And so what's happening is she's feeding off of her
Yeah.
children in order to feed her inner child. And as you know, as a mother, that's a one direction
Yeah.
street. The mother
Yeah.
nurtures the child. The child doesn't nurture the mother, not in
Right.
that way. And so when we get into that situation, that's the devouring mother, and it can look different. I guess different circumstances, like Munchausen by
Oh gosh, yeah.
proxy, if
Yeah.
I said that right. But that's an example of the devouring mother. But that's an extreme, but all the way down to I wish when I was younger I had done.
Mm.
And so therefore now I want you to do that,
Yes.
because I couldn't live out my life the way that I wanted to. And now I want you to
Yes.
do it. And
Okay.
that can be tricky because sometimes, I mean, we have valid reasons for feeling that way. Maybe we made poor choices when we were younger and we would like to not see our children make those same choices, and maybe suffer or struggle the way that we did. So it can be kind of a tricky, just like in the movie where she didn't really see what she was doing as being the mother in shadow. But the mother in light sees my child, even though I want to protect and nurture them, they also have the right to make their own choices, especially as they get older. And there's a point where I have to step back and let them do that.
Mhm.
Um, and so there's a balance but that's why we say all the archetypes have that kind of light and shadow balance, and it just depends on how conscious you are of what's
Yeah.
happening and how you're
Right.
responding.
Well, and so and like you said earlier too, that even Carolyn May says that there's 12 kind of active, but is it also true that there are different ones that are active based on where you are in your life?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, so they can flip-flop and move around based on your particular experiences, who you're interacting with, maybe a job,
Oh,
where you're living.
absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
life
So
impacts.
you'll have
Okay.
different ones come out in different circumstances, but you will also have so this is an example that she gives, which I think is just so interesting. So for instance, a person won't always manifest the mother until she gets to be a certain age. So the mother is actually part of the trinity of maiden, mother, crone. And so as a child, you may not exhibit the mother, or you might be the child that has brought home all the animals to care for and to heal. That can be a manifestation, but others wouldn't manifest the mother until they're getting to the point of considering to have children. So, but she gives a great example of how these can work, because basically what we do is all of our archetypes want to be in balance, and whatever balance is healthiest for us. And sometimes the way that they come into balance is through interaction and sometimes conflict with another person who has an archetype that challenges
Mm,
ours. And so it's almost that it's not coming to me, but this story, there was like an earth dome, eco dome, where they planted trees.
okay.
Do you know what I'm talking about? And they didn't, there was no wind, know anything. And so, but what they found was when these trees grew under in this very protected environment, and they were given everything they needed. They were given all the food and nutrients they needed, all the water. But what they were finding was the trees would just fall down. And then what they discovered was the trees really needed the wind, kind of the opposition of the wind, to grow really strong roots. So something similar can happen between archetypes. And so what she says is that in the beginning of a romantic relationship, in that what is that called? Like the dating
like,
phase, or when everything is just
there
the
you go. Well,
honeymoon
that's
phase,
that could be the
maybe?
honeymoon phase in
That's
the marriage
one.
part. But oh my God, yeah, you're right. The basically in love phase, the puppy love.
Yeah, yeah. So when you're in that kind of that Romeo Juliet, like you'll have particular archetypes that bring you together, that draw you together. And so you're very, like a
Oh
princess
my
and a
gosh,
knight
yes.
might be drawn together, right? But then what happens is when you get married, and especially at the point when you start to have children, you have a whole different set of archetypes that come online. And that's why, that just that ceremony of getting married, people have said, everything changed. Well, everything did change because suddenly your archetypes
Yeah.
changed. The ones that were present and really active. And at that point, it's the initial is to bring you together, but then it's the opposition to get you to grow. And so that can look really
No, I
interesting.
love that example. And I actually think we should even go more into that because I like to find connections between different ideas of thought. And when you said that, it makes me think of like the neuroscience of being in love and what's happening in our bodies and our brains and the physiology and the chemicals and how we're putting our best foot forward because we're trying to win a mate over, so to speak. And then,
Hmm.
but yet we're also, in some cases, consciously not showing part of ourselves because we have a fear of if we let this out, but eventually it's going to
Right.
surface. Is that true? I mean, is that correct to say that you can suppress a part of yourself in order to win the thing or get the prize or get the person or whatever it is you're aiming for? But eventually those pieces of you are going to
Right.
surface and need to be addressed. And what humans don't they don't grow in isolation.
Hmm.
We have to grow by being around other people because they do exactly what you're saying. They show you sides of yourself that maybe you're blind to, or they do something that triggers something in you that you haven't dealt with before or haven't dealt with in a long time. And now you're like, I need to bring this forward so I can address it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, and that is the from a divine standpoint. That's and we talk about soul contract. That is what's happening. Is you're coming together with someone that's going to present an opportunity to heal and or to grow. And
I want to highlight that you come into contact with people who can help you heal or help
right.
you grow. And if we look at all interactions that way, think about how much more like
Oh yeah.
positive that is. Instead of being like, that person on that app said the thing and made me mad and they're bad
Right.
people. Well, maybe, possible. You can take what they said, listen to it, sit with it, figure out why it made you feel that way, and then kind of move forward. If you get value out of it in some way, great. If you feel like you can't or don't, then
Yeah.
that's okay too. But
Yeah.
maybe not be so quick.
The opposition or people that we consider to be our enemies actually present the greatest opportunity for us to grow and to heal. And even if, I mean, this is where sometimes people are like, the whole idea of forgiveness and what that means. Um, Sometimes you just, it doesn't mean that you stay with them.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the lesson is you and I don't work well together, and I forgive you for that because I realize you're a teacher of some sort, but I realize that I need to take myself over here.
Yeah.
I mean, so that's an extreme form, but I mean, but it kind of illustrates the point that even our, what we consider to be our greatest opposition or our biggest enemies. Kind of the same idea, archetype. I mean, they're all archetypes, right? The idea of failure um, teaches us something, but what it's specifically doing is triggering our archetypal patterns in some kind of very specific way so that we can see. It's almost like if you had a panel of lights, right? And you're trying to diagnose where there's a disconnect. It almost gives you that lighted
Mm,
signal that this is a point where you need to pay attention.
right.
And so, yeah, we definitely do come together archetypally. And it's also an effort to kind of bring things into harmony. So we not only need to be in harmony with ourselves, but we need to be in harmony with other people and then with society as a whole. And so, it's that holographic, there's all these different layers at which we need to be in harmony. And the archetypes help us do that because it, like I said, it kind of pinpoints those places where we have a little bit of a sticking point or something that we need to kind of address
Yeah.
that maybe was never fully developed or, whatever it was.
Let's just say where would be a good place for people to go to learn more about archetypes and maybe even spend some time reading through the different explanations and descriptions and maybe even taking some sort of a quiz to kind of get an idea of where they are operating currently. It's not even correct language. Like, is that the way those
they
archetypes?
can schedule a session with me.
That's true. That's true. Oh my gosh.
No,
Of course.
well, like I said, Carolyn Mace has a ton of stuff on archetypes. She does have a book called Sacred Contracts. Young has done a lot of work with archetypes, but really, okay, so two things. Number one, a quiz is probably not the way to go because there are so many archetypal choices. And at the end of the day, it pays to pick. And so even with her methodology, when you do kind of an archetypal reading, the client picks their archetypes. They're not picked for them.
Okay.
And so there's an awareness that comes even in picking which archetypes you feel are strongest. And it's hard to do because typically when someone goes through, she has, I think, probably nearly 80 archetypes that she uses, but there's so many more. When someone goes through that and they're picking, you have your 4 standard that are given, but so then you're picking 8. It's really hard to do. And a lot of people will end up with 12 or 14 and say, I'm having a hard time narrowing it down.
Okay.
So anyway, long story short, there's benefit to figuring out which archetypes seem to suit you. And that can be tricky for another reason as well. Again, because we talked about kind of the negative connotation, some of those archetypes have just in their name, they have kind of a negative connotation. So, for instance, people tend to shy away from things like vampire or bully because if they're not really versed in that archetype and how it can be in light, they don't want to choose it. So that can be one. So sometimes we don't pick the archetypes that make us feel warm and fuzzy. Sometimes,
Yeah.
you have to pick the things sometimes that you find challenging. And so anyway, that I don't feel like I said that in a very organized way, but you do want to just kind of pick your own archetypes. You want to figure out what makes sense. And so some of them are given, I mean, if you're a mother, you're probably going to have mother in your set. Now you may not if that doesn't feel like it drives your life,
Okay.
right? And for some mothers it doesn't, but for some that is like one of their core, right?
Would it be helpful?
One of
Would
their
it be
core.
helpful to have somebody do it with you, like somebody you trust and respect, and like they know you? Like if you were,
Yes.
so like you and I
Yes.
could sit down with a list, and I could pick mine without telling you, and you could pick mine without me looking, and then we could kind of compare notes.
Right. Well, usually what'll happen is you'll pick, this is kind of actually what she recommends too, and or through that, framework that she's developed. You pick what you think, and then you ask people who are very close to you.
Mhm.
These are the ones I picked. What do you think?
Okay.
Do you think there's something I left out? And people, and it's interesting because if it's someone you trust and they know you well, yeah, I mean, sometimes they see things that you don't
Mhm.
see. And sometimes they see it in a pot. We're really hard on ourselves. That's what I find in my work is that
Interesting.
people tend to be extremely hard on themselves, much more than like, I'm going to gloss everything over. People are, they really, they just, they don't believe in themselves and they don't believe, I mean, that's probably not the right way to say it, but they're just very
Okay.
self-critical. And so you might not pick the bully because it feels like, oh my gosh, like I don't need one more thing
Mhm.
right, to add to the list. But the other person might say, well, yeah, you can be a bully, but you're a bully when you're getting me to take my vitamins every day and, do the things and to go for my walk every day. So, yeah, you're a little intense, but you're doing it to get me to do the things that I need to be
Mhm.
doing. You know what I'm saying? So they can kind of frame it in a more positive
Yeah,
way.
and I think of, like, the bully person in a corporate setting or a job setting where they may be really direct and forceful, but they're also a leader, and they know how to do it in a way that pulls out the best qualities of each person versus bulldozing them
Right, right,
or embarrassing them or shaming them.
right,
So it's not about, "You should be doing this, and I can't believe this, that, and the other," but it's more like, "We all have the potential to make this happen, and here's how it's gonna go,"
right.
or something along that line. I mean, I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it feels like it would be
Yeah, yeah.
a positive side of the bully. Okay.
Yeah, so that's so definitely, and like we've already said, the movies and literature, and that's a great way also to get to know archetypes because typically they'll pick a archetype, an archetype, and build that character around that because it makes the story more understandable, right? I mean, you just don't,
Mhm.
if you think about different movies, you don't typically have a character who's very multidimensional.
Mm-mm.
Maybe occasionally if it's the main character where you can see growth through like the hero's journey or something, but
Yes.
typically they're picking an archetype and using that to represent or using the character to represent that archetype. So that's a great way to get to know them. And as you know, especially if you're a reader growing up, what were the books that you loved or the movies that you loved or the TV shows? Was there a character that really always felt like you? And that can be a good way to identify some of your archetypal patterns too.
I think that would be an absolutely fun thing to do. Like, to take all of our shows that we enjoy, and maybe we'll even talk about this real quick because you and I used to watch Grace and Frankie.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And then we talked about the way that they presented each of those characters, and I think that's 100% accurate. Like, every character has an overblown,
Right,
personality related to an archetype.
right,
And that's what makes those shows so fun and funny because we know that none of those people really exist in isolation in our lives. We always see bits and pieces of those people in the people that we relate to, but we don't really have a Grace in our life or really have a Frankie in our lives,
right. Not to
most
that
likely, you know?
extreme. Yeah, not to that
Not to that
extreme.
extreme.
Well, what's even
Mhm.
a more fun thought is when you look at that, you have Grace and you have Frankie and you have Brianna and I can't remember, but really I mean, we might not have all of those depending on what our archetypal profile is, but if you think about if you roll those all into one, that's really our personality. As I mean, and that's why
Right.
we have a hard time because it just
Mhm.
depends on which aspect of your personality is at the forefront. I mean, so
Right.
one good example is when we get married and we have a fight or a disagreement, when does the child show up? Well, at the point that the child shows up, you might as well just stop because you're not going any further, not in a constructive way. And so that's when it can get really interesting. Like if you like for me, my child is a door slammer. And so
Uh-oh.
I know at the point that I start to slam a door, okay, all right, I got I gotta tap out. I'm getting too
Mhm.
like I'm going into a different place. I'm not showing up. in an archetype that can solve whatever's going on, or come to some resolution.
Gotcha.
And so
Okay.
that's why knowing your archetypes can be really powerful, because when you start to identify who has just shown up to the party. I mean, it is like a party, right? And if you
It
had the high
is.
school party and then somebody showed up, you're like, oh boy, it's going downhill now. We might as well shut it, right? We're going to shut it down. But that's the same thing that happens with our archetypes. And, we all
Yeah.
have that archetype that shows up and just is going to ruin the whole party. And if you know who that is, or what traits they manifest, it can make your relationships a lot more productive.
Yeah. I know I've said this to you before. I think of life as being just a nervous system experience, and our nervous system is constantly taking information in and making decisions, and either making them on the fly or unconsciously, or depending on where we are in our life and our journey, are we being really conscious of the signals that are coming in and how we're interpreting them and how we're perceiving them. So it's kind of like that, I would imagine. But instead of thinking of it just by the body sensation, being like, okay, who's stepping up to respond to this?
Right.
Like which part? And so it almost sounds like, we have split personalities, but it's not that. It's not the completely disconnected. It's more everything's interconnected and interwoven.
Right.
It's just that one section or one part has more of a voice depending on the situation and the circumstances.
Right. I mean, you can think of it, if it's helpful, like DNA. DNA has 4 building blocks arranged in different patterns, and that makes all the difference, right? And in all of our physical expression. And then depending on which of those are activated versus inactivated, that's, kind of the state of our health and well-being as well. So yeah, they're all intermingled together. We just we use them so we can break them out almost as, like, again, that building block that's a little bit more simple to look at. But it is interesting because you said, and again, this is kind of what's happening, is we're living in a world that's unknown. We really can't, well, I mean, I guess we can kind of see where it looks like we're going, but I think even from a homeschooling perspective, right now it's the most challenging I have ever remembered it being, because I don't even know what the world is going to look like in 10 years or 5 years. And so what are you preparing your child? Like before, I mean, especially when we were growing up, like you kind of knew how to,
I know.
what
I know what you're
you
saying. I
needed,
know.
right, to step out in the world. And now you don't even really know what your children need in order to exist in this world that's in such a state of flux. And so even just that, if you just take that piece and not all the other confrontation and stuff like that that's going on in addition to it, but that brings us into that fight or flight state. And as soon as we're in that state, it's those 4 archetypes that are running the show. And they influence even, so let's say if my 4 survival archetypes are active and my mother comes in, it does influence the mother and how she responds. And so there's always that kind of being aware that, okay, I know that these 4 are active, and it's not a bad thing. I mean, they're doing it for protection, but it is being conscious of how they're doing it. So it would almost be like, I think Elizabeth Gilbert uses the bus analogy, like, who have you got riding in the bus with you? And right. And if your saboteur is like, no, don't go down that road, it's dangerous, and they take the wheel from you, that's not a good situation. A better situation is for the saboteur to just say, I think that road is dangerous, let's not turn on it, and you listen, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the same situation with the survival archetypes, is being conscious enough of what they're trying to tell you to keep you safe, so that they're not trying to take matters in their own hands, and they're not negatively influencing the other archetypal patterns that bring in extra and bring in kind of that takes you out of the survival state and into an expanded state. Because that's what we need right now to get this all fixed in the world, is we have enough survival archetypes that are expressing. We need the mothers and the fathers and those that have that masculine feminine um, balance worked out, and a whole host of others, obviously. But um,
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that because that's one of the things for me that has just really it's just been hit on my heart a lot is to pull those people forward. Like, where are you? And I
mhm,
see you here and I see you there, but man, I would really like you to be on a bigger stage because I feel like people could learn so much from those who are representing the beauty of the human experience and the possibility of the human experience in a healthy light. And we have so many people with microphones and platforms who are in shadow
right,
and they are spending a lot of energy and expressing a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily coming from a healthy place.
right,
And so when you have a ton of people hearing that and then jumping on being like, well, they have a platform and they have a thing and they have a following, so therefore they must be right, and this goes across the spectrum.
mhm,
I mean, it just humans in general. I just wonder, it does feel like there's a shift, but it sometimes feels like it only feels that way when you're looking at certain parts
yeah,
of our society. And then if you go over here, you feel like everything's falling down apart and nothing's ever going to be okay anymore.
yeah,
And then you look over here and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I see hope, I see promise, I see people really developing and creating. So I think the reality is that that's the case and has been the case since the dawn of
oh
time.
yeah, it's
Depends
subtle,
on where you look,
yeah.
you know?
Well, and the other thing to remember too is that shadow speaks to shadow, and light
Is
speaks.
that kinda like is that kinda like victims or not victims, but, misery loves company?
Yeah, yeah, but person who's in shadow, so someone who's expressing, okay, so their child has come out, right? And it's in shadow, and it is yelling and it's arguing, and it's, like, what it's really wanting to say is my needs have not been met and I'm in a very scary place right now. But it doesn't do that, right? I mean, anybody who's
Mm-mm.
had children knows that when they're tired, when they're sleepy, they're not telling you I'm tired and I'm sleepy. I mean, you have to kind
Right.
of figure that out. And yeah, so when a child, when that child archetype comes up in shadow, it's going to it's almost speaking the same language as another child in shadow. And so we have two kind of interactions between archetypes. We talked before about how we tend to attract the archetypes that are going to heal us, or
Mhm.
bring us, not really heal us, but bring us back into some sort of harmony. But you also have a situation where you have the shadow talking to shadow. And
Okay. So
so
that's Twitter.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Where everybody's sort of jumping on and you're like, "Okay, has the whole world gone crazy?" My right? And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
and I guess the solution really is, it's a subtle shift, but and we've had this conversation so many times, is how do you show up the best in the world? And it's through doing your own work and being
Mhm.
aware of how you respond to things. And so you might not necessarily be able to fix the world, but you can fix yourself.
Yeah.
And
And your small little part of the world,
and that actually has
you know?
so much more impact than I think people even realize.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it has a magnificent effect, because when you are communicating through your light aspect, through your archetypal lighter aspects that are healed, it brings other archetypes that you're communicating with up as well.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's the really important part, is to recognize sometimes when people are getting into that mode on social media, and and some people that it's on both sides, right? It's not one side or another. We're seeing people on both sides that get into this very vicious, angry, hateful state, and then it's like people
Mhm.
start jumping on, and it seems like it's contagious, and in some ways it is, but it is just that shadow talking to shadow.
Mhm. Well,
um
it's kinda like the light, a light at night will attract moths to the flame, sort of,
oh, that
like,
too, definitely, yeah,
that you've got that going on, but then you've got people who feel justified in how they're feeling because they're seeing other people on such a magnanimous scale feeling the same way, but those aren't healed
yeah,
people
yeah, exactly,
or people who've necessarily done their work. And it's, I mean, I made a post a while back about the fact that, there are people in positions of power who are technically our leaders who have a lot of soul searching to do and a lot of inner work that they've
Yeah.
never done, or it doesn't appear that they've done.
Well, we've had this conversation that at a soul level, you have, I mean, we have different, we only look at physical maturity and really based on age,
Mhm.
but we have so many other levels of maturity that we don't even really factor in. There's emotional, there's mental, there's spiritual. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that are in power are at a toddler, maybe child
Mhm.
level of maturity. And so you have a lot of people, and then so when you have that happening, it's almost like the inmates running the asylum,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
or like the teacher has stepped out of the room and the whole room erupts into chaos. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Like when the teacher would leave and she'd leave one kid in charge and the whole room just went bonkers. Um, that's kind of what has happened. And so we need to bring those people back who have that higher level of maturity that can influence. And that's part of the problem that we're seeing in society, because it's not just the political leaders, it's teachers in schools. And I don't mean that across the board,
Mm-mm.
but we do have teachers that are they are almost that devouring mother archetype being expressed through teaching. And you can have obviously the devouring father as well, but it's that idea that I'm going to feed off of my students um
Boost
to
myself
make
or make,
my
yeah,
yeah,
or to
exactly.
justify myself in some way. I'm going
Mhm.
to impart my belief system or my wishes, because through them I am getting the attention and the respect that I think I deserve, or something along those lines.
Right.
Yeah.
Or the validation.
Yes, validation, that's the
And
word.
but anybody who knows who they are and has some level of maturity knows that you don't go to a child to
Mm-mm.
be validated.
Mm-mm.
That is the devouring mother father archetype. We get our validation from ourselves, and that's something that you can only develop on your own. And so as humans, we don't like to be challenged. We do like the easy road. And unfortunately, that's, I think, why the shadow feels so prevalent right now.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, I think
but
just talking about this, Sheila, and just bringing these words forward and giving them kind of some clarity and a definition, and can help people maybe recognize when they're seeing things, or even
yes,
notice when they're
yeah,
seeing it in themselves. So it's all about that conscious awareness, that if you can put a word to it, put an explanation to it, recognize that you are a complex being and there's multiple factors at play. Sometimes you don't even
hmm,
realize why you're feeling the way you are, but until you can kind of start sitting with it and maybe noticing your own patterns and your own reaction to things, like where is that coming from? What is it that you're trying to protect? What is it you're trying to avoid looking at? That all of this
exactly.
makes for a very interesting life experience, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and the thing is, once you see it, once you start to develop that sense of looking at things archetypally, and are they behaving in a more shadowy manner or a more light conscious manner? Once you see it, you just see it.
Yeah.
And so that is a positive, I think, in that, it does seem to be like the shadow is so prevalent right now. But once you see it, it doesn't ever go
Mhm.
away. And so it's really just a matter of kind of getting people to, not that you can get a person to that point, but we can get ourselves to
Yeah.
that point. And and then through interacting with others in a more positive way, it
Yeah.
helps them,
It's a ripple
because
effect.
we all need to be loved. Oh,
Mhm.
definitely. And we need to be loved and accepted. I mean, the problem with the shadow aspect is it's almost like a negative spiral that
Yeah.
can happen. But if you're interacting with someone with compassion, I might not like how you're behaving, but I understand that your child has now entered the
Mhm.
room because in some way you feel threatened. It When we can look at it that way, it doesn't make it so
Yes. Oh my
confrontational.
gosh, I know. If anything, it just makes you take a deep breath and relax a little bit more. It's not like you yourself have to
Yeah.
show up in the exact same way. You can just be like, they need some space. I'm giving them space, and don't
Right.
take it personally. It's not
Well,
about you. Almost every single incident in your entire life, if you ever just sit and think about it, it's not really about you necessarily. It's about them having an experience related to something you said or did or how you behaved or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that people can't push
Right.
buttons and trigger and know how to do it on purpose. That's definitely, but it still comes back to how you respond.
Oh, absolutely. And are you using it to your full advantage? And like you said, we don't take like when our children, and I always just kind of put it back in the framework of, I mean, and I have the benefit of being able to look at it from the perspective of a mother with her children. When my children, they're a little bit older now, but when my children were younger and they were hungry or tired, I didn't take that
Mhm.
personally. I just knew that they
Right.
needed something. And so what could I do to provide what they needed, knowing that that would remedy the situation that was
Mhm.
happening? And it's really no different. I mean, I don't want to call people children, but I mean, sometimes that is the part of us that comes up, and it happens for
Yeah.
all of us. And so when we can when we can look at someone in that manner, that it, like you said, it's not personal. um it just, this is a situation that we need to deal with, and you obviously need something, and let's see what we can do
Right.
about that. It's so much more constructive, and it moves us in a positive direction.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that tips the scales, right, towards more positivity and light
Yes.
and awareness and connectivity too. I mean, it connects us more when we have that common goal and common sort of
Hmm.
like we I think at the end of the day, if we were to take every single person who has expressed themselves on the internet and really sit down face to face with them and say, "What are your needs?" I think everybody's would be very
Yeah.
similar. It just would. You know,
Oh, right.
the human
Yeah.
condition has not changed really, I would imagine, since I mean, I can't say with certainty because I was not alive during the cave times and, thousands of years ago, but especially in our modern times, I mean, our needs really haven't changed. It's just the environments that we find ourselves in and the circumstances that we are in and the, resources at our fingertips that obviously has been the biggest
Yeah.
factors that have changed and created sometimes more chaos than calm.
Yeah. That made me think, I don't know how long you wanna go, but, I don't wanna take you over too far, but that made me think too that sometimes we do, you're talking about needs, right? We are tribal. We're a tribal species, for better or worse. And sometimes the archetypes themselves put us in a particular tribe. And then what we could get in the mistake of doing is that tribe is all we see, and we just align ourselves completely.
Mhm.
So do you know what I'm
Yeah,
talking
no, I
about?
do.
And it's like you politically, I mean, those are archetypes too, even though we not one we would necessarily put in our chart. But it's like I have to be all in with this tribe, because if I'm not, I might get kicked out.
Mhm.
And in tribally speaking, we want to feel a sense of belonging
Yeah.
somewhere. And that plays a factor as well.
It makes me think of the movie Divergent and how
Yeah.
you have to be in one of those particular areas to, benefit society as a whole, and you can't
Mhm.
have multiple ways of existing. You have to just pick one, or your brain is just in one, and that's it.
Yeah.
And that's where I think sometimes people get in that very rigid way of thinking because
Mhm.
in order to take risk and be vulnerable, thinking in different ways or looking at it more critically or recognizing that there's not always a black and white answer is scary because that means
Right.
that they might not be able to, like you said, they might not be able to stay where they think they belong or feel like they belong. And nobody wants to get kicked out. Nobody wants to be
Right.
in the middle
Right.
of nowhere without food, water, and access to shelter, you know? And
Yeah. Well, and sometimes we have to be willing. By the way, that's a great movie series.
it
If
is, I
anybody has not
know.
watched it, it is so good. Yeah, I recommend it. It's Veronica Roth that wrote the
Mm,
books. That is such, and it actually is. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it illustrates in a very basic way everything we're talking about with archetypes. And
mhm.
yeah, but if you watch the movies, you see why it's not ideal to have, to align yourself with one archetype and its tribe of people, of associated people. Um, Mostly because we're not one dimensional like that. and that
Mm-hmm.
one tribe will never fulfill all of our needs. So we almost have to be willing, and that's part of like the dark night of the soul, right? Where you're alone and you're
Mm-hmm.
that's why tribes used to do walkabouts. But what was there's another, it's an initiation, like do you know
Yeah.
what I'm
I mean,
talking about?
there's lots of different ones. There's the one where, yeah, you're left, you kind of go into the woods,
By
right? On your
yourself,
own.
right. And it's almost a shame that we don't do that anymore, because in a way that's this whole thing we're talking about requires that sense of, I'm going to step out on my own, letting go of all my attachments, and I'm going to see that I'm totally okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you come back, you don't have to draw so much on, well, on the survival archetypes to keep you safe. You know that you're safe.
Mm-hmm.
um so
When I think that's
yeah, that's kind of probably going too
No,
far,
not at
but
all. I think that's a good point to make because we don't have those sorts of rites of passages in our society anymore. I mean, there's plenty of discussion about that in some books I've read over the years. There's one called, I'm going to look it up real quick and tell me if you need to go
oh no,
because
I'm
I don't
good.
want to keep
I'm
you
good.
over too. Okay. Michael Gurian. I'm going to look him up real quick. The Purpose of Boys, I think is the name of his book.
Yes, yes. I think you actually
Pretty
gave
sure
me a
that's
copy of
right.
that book, or
Okay.
recommended
Yeah,
it
that
at least. But
yeah.
yeah, we don't have
Yeah,
rites
so
of passages anymore. Not
mm-mm,
really. The interesting thing though is that, and so going back to the mother archetype, the mother does have, well, actually really two. You have the rite of passage, they're built in to a woman's body. So you have the rite of passage of puberty, starting the menstrual cycles. And then you have, well, three, I guess. And then you have the rite of passage taking you into motherhood, which is birth.
right.
And then
Yep.
you have menopause, which is the final rite of passage taking you into the crone phase. And men, unfortunately, don't really have those same rites of passages built into their, just their very
Their
existence.
physiology
Right,
almost, right?
right.
Like just that yeah, okay.
And so that might be
Well,
one reason why I think a lot of tribes focused on rites of passage for men. But I think not every woman's going to decide to be a mother. And so it really is important for us to figure out our own rites of passage. And how do we,
yeah.
sometimes it can just be a psychological journey where, well, and a lot of times, unfortunately, we just have them that happen. A dark night of the soul. So when my husband passed, that was a dark night of the soul, and it
Mm,
was a rite of passage in that we were a partnership, and then I had to figure out how to do it on my own. And that was a really, and nobody could do that. People could help, but nobody could help me
mhm,
come to terms with that, right? Not
mm-mm,
not my inner world. And that is the type of, I mean, it's like, makes it sound like everybody needs to suffer, and that's not what I'm saying. But when you do have that dark night of the soul, there, it does create of its own accord that rite of passage, and that
yeah.
can bring a lot of these archetypes into their full embodiment. It's and it can almost do it in a way that sometimes nothing else can. But it's I don't know, I kind of lost my train of thought
No,
there, but
I you hit on it, and it's true. I mean, it's not that we're trying to say you have to suffer, and we wanna make you suffer. It is that life is about the mixture of joy and suffering, and it's gonna
yeah,
happen one way or the other. If and that's one of the things I've said to my children, and I keep this in the forefront of my own mind, is that every single human on this planet is on that wheel of pain and suffering and
yes,
joy and elation.
yes,
And just because you see people on joy and elation doesn't mean they haven't been on the
right,
wheel of pain and suffering, and vice versa. And so trying to remember that just because you're seeing one aspect of their lives doesn't mean that's their entire life, and you don't know what they've had to do to get there.
right,
So just to keep remembering that really it's about you and your learning and what you can add to your own understanding and then your own value day in and day out. um, One piece I wanted to go back to was when you mentioned the rite of passages for women and then going into the menopause phase and the crone phase. Isn't there something in the shaman idea or experience, or maybe it's just indigenous cultures, there's women, they turn to the elders, particularly the women,
Mm-hmm.
after
Mm-hmm.
they've gone through menopause.
Yeah,
Is that correct? Am I remembering that right?
that
Okay.
is. Yeah.
What
And
what
a
is
lot of
that
times,
about?
oh gosh, I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure I can speak completely knowledgeably about that. um, I just encourage anybody to look this up on their own. But my understanding of it is that women who were still bleeding, so still in childbearing years, and I'm sure there's a lot of reasons for this, right? Number one, they wanted women, well, indigenous societies, so backing up, indigenous societies didn't have as many children as European societies tended to. And there's
Okay.
differences. European families were trying to tend farms, family farms, and they needed the hands, right? Whereas indigenous communities tended to be more integrated, so it wasn't divided up by families the same way Europeans divided, and they would have fewer children. So they would have fewer children within the entire tribe, and then the entire tribe would take part in the raising of them. But so
Mm,
they had adequate, I mean, more than we can probably imagine, mother archetypes to nurture them, and father archetypes to teach them the skills that they needed. So that might have been part of it, just because the women were so involved in the rearing of children. Not that they can't be after menopause, but the other part of that is, as far as I know, is that they could not be medicine women while they were bleeding. And there, I don't remember the exact reason for that. I mean, it was something about the way they would show up kind of in the unseen realms, where a shaman would journey to retrieve medicine for the tribe. It impacted the cycle of bleeding, would impact that. And so a lot of times they couldn't become medicine women until after they had
mm.
gone through
Well,
menopause.
when I think about it from a protective state, it almost would seem as if those who are still within childbearing years had a bit of vulnerability to them
Hmm.
because of their need to protect the children.
Hmm.
That sort of innate, like, I have to focus my energy and attention on the children, and I can't necessarily focus on the needs of the entire tribe or do
Right.
something outside of the realm of right here and right now.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, and if you look in modern day culture and sort of the expression of the woman in menopause, it's the I don't give a shit kind of mentality.
Yeah.
Like sort
Yeah.
of the, like I don't care what people think about me, and
Yeah.
I am fine in myself, and I know who I am, and it is fine if you don't like me. So there's a little bit of that like saucy sassiness that kind of comes
Oh,
with
yeah.
some people after they go through the childbearing years and then come out on the other side.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's a little piece of that in there.
Well, and I mean, from my own experience, I'll tell you, one of my children really pushed me. Of course, you learn from every single one of your children because they're different,
Mhm.
right? But I have one child in particular who really pushed me we came together archetypally, and it really evolved my mother archetype, because what was happening was we would have never made it the way that we started out, right? And that's, I mean, that's what I was saying
Mm.
earlier, is we challenge each other archetypally. And so we often think about that as partners, but sometimes it's a parent child. And
Oh, yeah.
we'll just say that this particular child was very headstrong. And, there was no amount of that I could put into that was going to change their mind. And so it required me to become, or to
Mm.
develop, a different aspect of motherhood that was a lot softer and more open minded, if that makes sense. And so we do mature through that. And that's why it's such an important rite of
Yeah.
passage, right? Because it involves an evolution. And so we change as mothers. And quite frankly, and I'm not fully through it, we're never fully through it when we're mothers. But man, you get through that. And
Mhm.
I think you probably are just like, okay, I did that, and they're like, I am pretty much good to go. I can handle anything that's thrown my way, right? I think most parents
Mhm.
can relate. At some
Yeah.
point you
Yeah, yeah.
come up against that. It's there's nothing that will change you like being a parent.
Yeah. Well, it's like they said, they put the mirror up and you really have
Yeah.
to see yourself and through the eyes of and you know, my kids, we joke, and you know that we're very silly and we joke with each other, and they'll say stuff sometimes. I'm like, I
Yeah.
just said
Yeah.
that. Oh my God. Okay. Sorry. Or they're like, "Wait,
Yeah.
okay, mom, I'm being a little sassy. You need some food." I'm like, "What?" And then you know, because I'm just in my own mind and doing my thing, and then but my behavior is doing another thing. And so yeah, no, they do. They call us out, and then if we're
And that's so important
mhm,
to allow that, right?
mhm,
Because I mean, even husband wives or partners or teacher student. I
mhm,
mean, any kind of dynamic like that. If you make it one sided, and you're basically shutting down the archetype that's trying to give you what you need to evolve.
right.
And so it is important to, because they'll tell us, and I mean, they're usually not very shy about it, so
Yeah.
they will tell you.
They don't have a bunch of baggage to, yet to, like, keep
Right,
them from
right,
saying
yeah,
what's on their mind. So, well, listen, I don't think we adequately expressed what you do and how you show up in the world, and I want us to,
oh
spend some
gosh.
time doing that. So can you explain to people what you do with your business? And like you mentioned earlier, if somebody wanted to do a session with you, even though they might not be able to do one physically with you, that's still an option to do something virtually. So will you just
Yeah,
explain what you do and how and of course, like you said earlier, you were a chemist and you had a physical autoimmune issue, and you were less than impressed, I guess, I hope I'm not putting words in your
yeah,
mouth about how
yeah,
the standard
no, no,
medical establishment was handling things. And
right.
so I will just leave it at that, and then you can tell us kind of like what you do now.
Okay. Gosh, I don't know why this is always so hard for me to put it into words. But yeah, so I mean, Western medicine just wasn't working for me. It was either ineffective or I was responding not well to it, just kind of having adverse side effects, and started exploring some different things like herbs and homeopathy, and that I saw an improvement, but it still wasn't there. And I just remember one day coming across this woman, and I wish I remembered her name so I could give her credit, but she also had an autoimmune condition, and she just posted one day on Facebook that she had this realization that she would never get fully healthy until she learned to love herself.
Hmm.
And that just opened up this whole idea to me,
Like a
or
portal
whatever.
almost.
Yeah, I mean, it's bigger than an
Yeah.
idea. Um, but that we aren't just physical. We have all of these other layers, and I was only focused on one.
Mm.
And so that, I think from there, and I was exposed to it because I would go to herbal conferences and things like that. I was exposed to shamanism, and that started coming in just really strongly for me. So I do a lot of work in the shamanic tradition, and and let's see. I mean, just general energy healing. So Reiki is something most people probably have heard of. Uh, gosh, see,
I know, and it's
like
hard.
blah
It's
blah
hard
blah
to
blah
do
blah blah.
because it is. It's like asking somebody, "Who are you?" I'm like, "Okay, how long do you have?" What striker have I got?
Right, right. I mean, all the different things. So yeah, I do a lot of work with the shamanism, the different techniques, but predominantly teaching people. So in the traditional shamanic tradition, and this is relevant. It's going to sound like I'm going way far afield, but in indigenous societies, the shaman would actually do the healing on behalf of.
Mm.
So, like for instance, if there was a point, like they called everything poison, like even if it was energetic, but they would take on the poison, transmute and transform it, and then accomplish the healing on behalf of the tribe or the person or whatever the situation was. That has shifted. For our whole world right now, because and so we have a lot of healers that want to do healing on behalf of someone else, but it's not really effective anymore, and I think part of that is because we are in this state of flux. Humanity is, and I personally believe, even though it looks so um chaotic and and crappy right now, I do think we're evolving.
Mm.
I think we're in the phase where we're doing that spring cleaning where you just pull everything out.
Mm-hmm.
And you have that moment of freak out, like, oh my gosh, this isn't what I was trying to accomplish. But once everything is out, then you can really start to sort through
Yeah.
it and what needs to go and what can be donated, what, putting everything back in these more organized fashion. And so we're in this, and there's so much work that needs to be done that healers cannot really heal on behalf of another person the way that indigenous, like it would happen in an indigenous society.
Mm.
And so now what healers I I believe are being called to do is to help people learn how to heal themselves. And there is no better healer than the self, right? Because the self is the only one capable of really knowing what's going on in that interior world. And so part of what I do is I teach other people how to do, for instance, a shamanic journey to get their own information or to contact, another realm of archetypes, their power animals or their spirit guides. And so these are all also archetypal patterns that we can use, for insights or whatever we need to. So that's part of what I do. And then I also do QHHT, which is quantum hypnosis healing technique. And it's from Dolores Cannon. It's what Dolores Cannon developed and has written all of her many, many books on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's again another technique that takes someone into a hypnotic state, and where they're able to retrieve information um, for themselves, and then it's recorded so they can listen to it and go back into that state. But I guess another story that might be worth telling is the story of when I had melanoma,
Yes.
which, by the way, I just did 5 years. I just
Yay! Oh my
did the
gosh.
fast 5 year part. And so the story is, just to illustrate that we can heal our own bodies, is that 5 years ago, just slightly more than 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with melanoma. And like I said, I'm kind of not a big fan of Western medicine, but I had family members that are. And so we had to come to a little bit of a compromise. And so I agreed to get the surgery to have it removed. But I wasn't willing to do anything else. And in the meantime, I was like, okay, so I will do that. But in the meantime, it took like 4 weeks to even do the surgery. In the meantime, I'm going to do my own thing, which is working with my body to heal it. And so when they did the surgery, because of the way melanoma grows, it grows deep, which is why it's so dangerous. But it can also spread and create these satellites. And so when they surgically remove, they take this huge section, but they do pathology on the entire thing, just checking to see if it had spread. And so my original biopsy was confirmed by 3 different pathologists. So it was definite that I had it. But then by the time they did that surgery and they did the pathology on that section, there was no trace of cancer whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. So
And
cool.
and I remember the nurse calling me, and she was in person, she was not a very excited person. I mean, that's a hard job, I can imagine. And but she was very excited when she called me, and I couldn't even quite figure out what was happening. But she said, there was no trace. And I said, oh, so you got it all? She said, no, you don't understand. There was nothing there.
Oh my
We
gosh.
never, ever see this.
Mm.
It's just a miracle. And so I just, so it's possible to heal ourselves. And part of that is understanding who you are and accepting that who we are doesn't always look pretty, but it's still something that we can leverage if we use it in the right way. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's how archetypes can be so powerful. And that is something else that I do.
Yes.
So to bring it back around to that, I do offer the archetypal consultations according to Carolyn Mace's her methodology, which I think is, it's not the only way to look at it, but it is a very interesting, powerful way. You can either do like who your core group of archetypes are. Actually, that's where you start. So you always need to know who your core archetypes are. But then as you're going through, like there's one called Journey to Transformation. And it's basically if you're here and you want to get to some new place, it gives you an archetypal pattern of what that journey looks like and how to leverage all these. And that includes, so your chart of origin is 12. The Journey of Transformation uses 36 archetypes.
Oh my gosh.
And it's a lot, but it's broken down into different, so in your family, you have these 3 archetypes, and this is the journey from one to the other. And it's so cool because it gives you you realize how many allies you have and how many tools that you have at your disposal. If you only know, if you can acknowledge who and what they are. So it's like the acceptance of, without judgment. And then how do you bring them into their best light and utilize them? And I mean, that's what we all need really at the end of the day, right? We need to be not judged and seen for our profound potential and how amazing each of us is. And, the best practice is to do that on yourself. And, the good starting point is to do that through the archetypes.
Well, I think that's fascinating. And it is, I love I love your story and the fact that you took the opposite approach of what we know, that stress can create illness and negative thoughts can cause us to be sick. And you did the opposite. And you're like, what I can do the positive approach and heal myself. And,
right.
And I think people underestimate the power of their ability to help themselves, their minds. It's like, what we said, well, maybe we didn't say this in this conversation, but it's been said multiple times that we are our thoughts in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah.
And how we think and what we process and run over in our minds almost can be reality, becomes our reality. So I love that story. And it's just a good reminder, that we're more powerful than we give ourselves credit for.
Yes. And I think it needs to be said too, even though we're going so far, is that and it's not conspiracy theory, but the system does not want us to know how powerful we are. So we can't use the system it's why we have to go in and develop and heal ourselves, because the system doesn't promote that. It's about conformity and rules and kind of making everybody the same. And so I think part of our healing journey is that we have to be willing to let go of that, and let go of feeling like that's our parachute in some way. Because it's ultimately really holding us back. And you have to just trust that, like I said, everybody is so hard on themselves. It would just be amazing if people realized really how much potential and strength that each of us has, and the capacity to love. It's just, we haven't necessarily been given that opportunity, and it is an opportunity I think that we have to grab for ourselves and make it happen.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to schedule a consult with Sheila, she is graciously offering listeners 15% off. Use the code LGB15 at checkout. The link to her site and offerings will be in the show notes. In addition, the link to the Barefoot Playground, the kickoff event on February the 16th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, will be linked in the show notes as well. As always, stay curious, stay connected, and stay aware. Until next time.